Christopher Saunders is an emeritus professor whose career as a lecturer began at UCT, the University of Cape Town, in the 1970s. His work has explored questions of historiography and the sources of historical inquiry. It has been obligatory reading for just about every South African history student, myself included. He is the co-author of the Historical Dictionary of South Africa and South Africa, A Modern History,
which is also obligatory reading for all historians of South Africa. And he's going to be the first guest of our feature on Conversations with Historians. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope that what I say will be of some interest.
Well, could you start by telling us what kindled your passion for history as a subject?
Well, as long as I can remember, I've always been interested in reading about the past, and I always prefer that to reading fictional accounts of whatever. When I was in secondary school, there was a choice, strangely enough, between French and history. My parents were very keen for me to take the French class, but I insisted, no, I must take the history one. And I had a good history teacher at secondary school, and that was the only subject in matric that I got a distinction for. I have always been interested in history, but I never thought that I'd become a historian. I mean, that was quite out of the. I had no background in anybody. I knew nobody who had become a historian when I was at secondary school. And so, just to carry on the story, I mean, when I went to UCT as an undergraduate, I started with law, and but you could take in a general BA. You took law subjects, but you could also have an optional additional subject. And of course, I took history. And so I majored in history along with the law subjects, which I found very boring. And so I decided at the end of the BA to give up law and then do history honors and went on from there.
What aspects of history were actually taught in the secondary school? So what were the subjects? What captured your imagination? Was it taught particularly well, or was it particular content that kindled your interest there?
Yes, well, it was both, I suppose. Not the South African content. I, along with most of my other friends and associates, were terribly bored by the South African content that we were given. But we were taught well generally, and I had a teacher who did bring it alive, so that helped.
So from there on, you went to Oxford. Could you please tell us, how did that happen?
Yes, okay. Yes, well, not immediately. I should perhaps mention at this point that well, at the end of my honours, I did get a minor scholarship, not a Rhodes Scholarship, but a minor scholarship that did allow me to go anywhere that I wanted to. And so I did actually apply to both Oxford and Cambridge, and I was accepted at both. The reason for going to Oxford was because I was offered a place where you could stay in college for the duration of I decided to do another undergraduate degree. And so that's where I went to Oxford initially to do in 2 years. You could do a degree in 2 years. And Balliol offered that I could stay in the residence there for those 2 years. So that's why I went there. But before I went to Oxford, I think I should mention that I had a period of more than 6 months where I worked for Monica Wilson on the Oxford history of South Africa. She wanted a research assistant, and so I did that. And that was really, it was at that point that I really began to, I was aware already by then. Leonard Thompson had left to go to California, but he came back, and I was in with some discussions with him about the Oxford history, and that was really very exciting. And of course, I can talk more about that if you want me to. But then from there, I went to Oxford initially to do this undergraduate degree, and then just to carry the story on, towards the end of that period, I Leonard Thompson arranged for me to go to California, to where he was in Los Angeles, UCLA, to do a PhD. And then I had this big decision to make about that. But I decided that that would have meant that I would have had to then do an MA in the US system before actually going on to the thesis. And I felt I couldn't do that. And also, Los Angeles was very remote for me. And whereas by that stage I knew my way around Oxford, and very fortunately for me, I had then an offer to go to St. Anthony's to do my doctorate. And so I sent Thompson a letter saying, no, I'm not coming, which I don't think he ever really forgave me about. But anyway, and I stayed at Oxford for another few years to do the doctorate.
I do want to ask you a bit more about Oxford, but I'm now intrigued with this early connection with Monica Wilson and Leonard Thompson, especially since you made such a mark in studying South African historiography. So were there seeds planted during this time when you were, I won't say not exposed to them, but was able to have contact with them and see them in action?
Yes, certainly there was, because that was the time when Thompson was talking about decolonizing South African history, and it was he was also working on that volume that became African Societies in Southern Africa, and for us at that time, for me at that time, this was terribly exciting new work which was going to revolutionize South African history, etc. And so I was caught up in that, although the particular work that I did for Monica Wilson was rather detailed. It was looking at the work of travelers and others in the interior and trying to plot where African people had been living when the first contact was made. That was the sort of idea that led to my first publication, which was a short article in the Quarterly Bulletin of the South African Library, called Early Knowledge of the Sotho, which was sort of based on that. And to my surprise, that article has had some continuing attraction, has interest in it over a long period. But anyway, so that's what I did with Monica Wilson, yes, who was, of course, a very inspiring figure, although she was an anthropologist, of course, but with a great interest in history.
And immediately it just strikes me what a contrast it was compared to what you've just called the very boring South African high school history that you had to do.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it was. Yes, we had Fowler and Smith. I don't know if you know, a sort of terrible textbook at school. I mean, it was awful. And so now when, this new work was just really a great breakthrough. Yeah.
Sorry, Chris, can you just give me an idiot's guide as a map of the trajectory? So we've got to Balliol already, and you're doing, is it a DPhil that you're doing there? Was there a master's or anything in between? I just want to know sort of.
No. I went from my history honours at UCT to Balliol to do that degree, that second undergraduate degree. I didn't know. I don't think at the time, that the master of Balliol was Christopher Hill, and I had actually done in history honours a course on the English Civil War, English Revolution, with somebody called Mandelbrot, and then when I went to Oxford, I had the opportunity to do a special subject. So. And Christopher Hill was teaching it, so I decided. I was terribly shy and nervous as a student, and so I didn't gain as much as I should have from his teaching. But anyway, I did have tutorials with him on that special subject, and I also had tutorials with Richard Cobb, who was an incredible historian of the French Revolution, and there was somebody else on the English Civil War called Donald Pennington. Anyway, I had some very top-class, teachers there at Oxford, but also I was able to go and attend lectures by, very eminent people. The ones that I remember most vividly were by Isaiah Berlin, which were absolutely incredible to me. So, you know, while I was an undergraduate, I took opportunity to do as much as I could within the Oxford context. And then when I came to the thesis, then part of the time I was away because I came back to South Africa to do some field work here. And then before I had actually completed the thesis, I suddenly got an opportunity to apply for the job at UCT, and so I did apply for that and got that, and I hadn't yet actually completed the thesis when I returned. But should I talk a bit about the thesis, or maybe you've got some other questions?
I've thrown us a bit off course with my digression, but thank you for clarifying all of that. But what I also wanted to focus on is that if we're getting to the late 60s, early 70s, it should be around the time that Stanley Torpedo is moving from Durham to Cape Town. Am I right, or am I wrong? And also, it's a very fertile time in the southeast of England.
Yes.
In terms of what will be the new South African historiography.
Yes.
I just wanted to know about student experiences at the time. Are you networking with people like Balliol and Van Onselen? Did you meet them there at all? And what was it like? Just give us an atmosphere. If there was, were you aware that this was an exciting, fertile time of reconsidering South African historiography?
Yes. Well, I have to mention there that so I decided to stay on at Oxford, and there weren't any South African historians at Oxford at that stage. Stanley Torpedo hadn't yet moved from Durham. And what I was caught up in for my thesis was really a seminar of imperial historians who, the most famous was Jack Gallagher, who, Africa and the Victorians and so forth. And my supervisor himself was Freddie Madden, who was an imperial historian, essentially. So that was my problem in a way, that I'd been caught up in all this new work about African societies in Southern Africa, etc. But when I came to think about a thesis topic, I had to choose a topic that sort of fitted into that framework that I had at Oxford. And so my thesis, to my regret in a way, was very much focused on the process of annexation of the Transkei and territories, rather than focused in any kind of detailed way on the people themselves in the Transkei, if I put it that way. And so to come more towards your question, of course, Oxford wasn't far from London, but I know I became aware when I was at Oxford that there was very exciting new work being done in London on South African history from a new, different direction, of course, critical of the Oxford history, and etc., the radical, beginnings of the radical revisionists. And I did actually go to London a few times to attend Schuyler Marx's seminar, and there I did meet some of these people who were going to be very active in the new radical historiography, but I didn't actively sort of participate, being away in Oxford. And what I did do was I presented a paper which is in the first volume of the seminar series that Schuyler Marx put out on what I call the new educated elite in the late 19th century. And then coming out of that was an article on Nehemiah Thiele and the Tembu Church, which was published in the Journal of African History in 1970, I think. So those were kind of peripheral interests in what was actually going on in the Transkei, other than the process of annexation, which I was focusing on in my thesis. So with regret, I was really on the periphery of the new radical revisionist historiography at that stage.
If you don't mind, I would actually like to drill into that a bit, because
yes, certainly.
It's a debate that has always fascinated me, the radical liberal debate. So if you, and I think it's very significant that you found yourself somewhat on the periphery. So what was your sense of these developments, but also within the framework of the exposure you had, both at UCT and to Monica Wilson and Lena Thompson, and then again, Oxford with being a different framework, which also determines so much of how you approach your PhD thesis. So again, I would love to hear your interpretation or your sense of this at the time. And also later, if this fed into how you engaged with it later in your work.
Yes, I think it did. Let me just mention a few sort of personal anecdotes, if you like. One is that I did have the opportunity when I was out in South Africa working on my thesis to make a trip to Lusaka, where Leonard Thompson and John Omer Cooper arranged a conference that led to the publication of the book on the African societies in Southern Africa. And at that conference, there were various rather acrimonious debates between, for example, Schuyler Marx and Monica Wilson. I remember, I began to pick up at that stage, and I'm afraid it was confirmed later, that some of the people in the new radical revisionist school adopted a very critical view, which is okay, but unfortunately it was sort of tied to rather personal attacks as well on the liberal historians. And I regretted that from the beginning. I mean, if you went to some of the seminars in London, I think especially in the early 70s, after I then, went back to London to hand in my thesis and so forth. So I was around there in about 72 and so forth. And I remember going to some of Schuyler Marx's seminars, which were extremely acrimonious. And, when I was too shy, of course, to say anything, but people were shouted down basically if you didn't, unfortunately, it wasn't a very academic atmosphere. So and that put me off. So I kind of, in a way, retreated from that. But I've always regarded myself as a liberal historian, although I appreciated the great work that was done by so many of these radical revisionist historians. But, I came out of a background of sort of anti-apartheid from a liberal perspective. I mean, I always was very appreciative of the sort of big figures, like Helen Suzman, of course, in the Progressive Party, but before that, people who'd been active in the Liberal Party. I admired them, and they included people, like Rodney Davenport, who we may want to come on to discuss later, and others. And so I saw myself in that context as a liberal historian, and that sort of ties into liberal politics as well, sort of concern about freedoms and rule of law and so forth. Whereas these radical historians, some of them went overboard, emphasizing class to an extreme. I mean, which was okay up to a point, but they were, I suppose, some of them committed to a sort of socialist future, which I never was. So there were these disagreements from the beginning.
Sorry. Yeah. Final question, just on that, because in the sense I also got, because as someone who came a few decades after, I also picked up on some of these dynamics that you mentioned. But some of the sense I got also was that liberal historians felt a bit on the back foot in response to the new radical history. Am I right in picking up that sense, or is that just my interpretation?
Yes, I don't know whether on the back foot is quite the right word, but I think it took some time for them, liberal historians, to sort of appreciate and to incorporate, some of the ideas of the radical historians, and then gradually over time there was a kind of coming together, I think, as I see it. But it was these personal animosities that unfortunately they were very apparent in the 70s and 80s. And some of the radical historical work was highly structuralist and just liberal historians, I think, were unsympathetic to the sort of directions that some of that work went. When I wrote my historiographical survey, the making of the South African past, some people got the wrong impression that I was actually at the end of that verging towards a radical sort of position, which I was trying to explain, but I wasn't actually agreeing with.
I've got a very small point of intellectual substance of these debates before we move forward, and I don't want to lose us momentum. I'm very interested to hear that you were at that Lusaka conference in 1968, and one of the questions which I have is that would have been a conference focused on pre-colonial history, and the liberal radical debate that we're aware of is one which is based very much on race, class, and nation. It's after settlement. Do you recall at all what the difference between Marx and Wilson was about with regards to pre-colonial history? Because we're not aware as historians about the liberal radical debate about the pre-colonial as opposed to the colonial past.
No, you're absolutely right on that. I think, Schuyler Marx was always critical of Monica Wilson for not really being a historian and seeing things in too sort of static and perhaps romantic sort of terms about pre-colonial history. And so she was critical of that. But you're right that the sort of radical debate as it emerged in the 70s wasn't present at that conference at all, and it was only gradually, as I say, through my exposure to Schuyler Marx's seminar, and also I said that there weren't any South African historians at Oxford in the faculty, but of course there were a couple of students, and the one student that I did get to know was Rick Johnstone, who was really, of course, became a leading figure in the radical school in the 70s, and then unfortunately disappeared to Canada. I lost touch, and I don't know what he became of him. But I used to know him when I was at St. Anthony's, and then of course a bit later Colin Bundy and others came on the scene. But yeah. But you're right. That's right. That the Lusaka conference wasn't involved with it.
Awesome, Lindie. Shall we resume the course back to South Africa?
Yeah. So I would actually be very interested to know a bit more about your PhD thesis on the Transkei, why you chose the Transkei, and how that set you onto the next path.
Okay. Yes, it was, as I said, I had to choose a thesis that I could study in Oxford. So to some extent, there was some source material in Oxford that I could use, papers of some of the Cape politicians, John Martino's papers, for example, the first Prime Minister of the Cape, and the papers of the Aborigines Protection Society and so forth. But I think I chose the Transkei because for Monica Wilson, I had actually been looking a bit at that area. And of course, coming from the Cape, I was sort of interested in the Cape, and I was interested in the area of sort of first contact between settlers and indigenous people, and at that time, it struck me that it was a sort of open area for research, and so that's why I looked at the Transkei. And then, under the influence of these imperial historians, I was sort of persuaded to look at the process in which the Cape and Britain sort of took over the Transkei. So that was what my thesis was focused on. But as I said, I was somewhat unhappy with that, and that may help explain the fact that when I'd completed it, I obviously had the option of trying to rework it along the lines that I might have preferred to take, but I was afraid by that stage I was so tired of it that I decided to just, when I had the opportunity, to publish it as a thesis. So it was published in the Archives yearbook exactly as it was written as a thesis without a single change, updating or anything like that, some years later. But by then I'd already moved on to other things. And if you want me to just mention what those were, when I came, well, first of all, I have to say that when I came to UCT, I was thrust into teaching, and I had the extraordinary chance that the first honours class that I was given to teach had a group of absolutely brilliant students in it, and they included, and one of them was William Beinart, and I can still remember that he was active in sort of student affairs, and he knew that there was a scheme for inviting a visitor to UCT. And he came to me and he said, did I know anybody from Oxford who might like to come to UCT to teach in the history department? And so I said, yes, I know Robin Hallett, who was just at that stage completing his second volume, History of Africa, for the Michigan Press. And so he came out. And then I have to explain that the professor in the history department was Eric Axelson, who had, to his credit, started a course on African history, but he himself was very involved with the Portuguese in Africa, and he was very brilliant in that field, but he didn't really know anything about the rest of Africa. And anyway, he then went into administration, and so he basically left the department. So they needed somebody to take over African history. So Robin Hallett came out and took it over, and was incredibly stimulating. He was a brilliant lecturer, and he very sort of charismatic figure. Unfortunately, I was able to help him because he built up the numbers. African history numbers grew vastly, and so I helped him, and I was caught up in that. And then Robin, to his credit, also was one of these historians who always had a deep sense about knowing about the local environment. And so when he was here in Cape Town, he wanted to know about the history of Cape Town, and he was influenced because he came from Oxford, and he was involved with the Ruskin movement, sort of history from below, E.P. Thompson, etc. He wanted to do something similar with Cape Town, and he began to organize other people to come into that, and I was one of them, and I helped organize the first workshop on Cape Town history, which we had a whole series of, and we produced studies in the history of Cape Town, and my particular interest was the early history of the African locations, townships in Cape Town, and I wrote some articles on that. And I've always been sad that the one article that I wrote, which I thought was one of the best, I sent to the Journal of African History, and they said, no, it's not enough class analysis in it. And so it was never published in that form. Anyway, but that's what I got caught up in the sort of mid-70s, I suppose. Although also I did carry on with my interest in the Eastern Cape because, and that maybe I should mention that Axelson had contacts with Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer wanted some material in his Brinter's library published, and so he wanted to start a series of Brinter's publications, and I was caught up with that, and I was persuaded to edit, first of all, the Kitchingman papers, which were the papers of a missionary, London Missionary Society, missionary in the Eastern Cape. And then Basil Accordia and I went on to publish the papers relating to the War of the Axe. And then Colin Webb came into the department at some stage, and he'd come from Natal, Natal, and he was involved with the University of Natal Press, and he persuaded me to edit two books about the Eastern Cape. The one was the Reminiscences of Charles Brownlee, and the other was the memoir of William Dower, who was a missionary in Griqualand East. So in the 70s, I did a lot of that editing work, which rather, looking back on it, was probably a waste of time to some extent. But okay. Well,
Chris, I'm very interested by, sorry, can I take this one? Sorry, and then,
Yeah.
sorry, Lindie. I'm very interested by the direct line which you have through Hallett from the Ruskin movement to
Yes.
Cape Town, because it's often, including by me, falsely, I realize now from what you're telling me, interpreted as one which led to the Wits History Workshop. What were your responses to the Wits History Workshop? I mean, were you starting
Yes.
with your initiative before them, or were you
Yes.
subsequent to them? What's the
We were.
relationship there?
Yes, we were. The Wits History Workshop only started sort of after the Soweto uprising, and Belinda Bazzoli, started it then as a reaction to that, I think. And I did go to the first of their conferences, which I think was in 1977 or 78, or one of those years. She was brilliant in bringing people together to work on similar themes to the ones that we had started working on in Cape Town. Unfortunately, I have to maybe interject here that Robin Hallett went back to Oxford, to England. Basically, he never got a permanent job, but he left. He was only here at Cape Town UCT on contract for a set period, and at the end of that period, I mean, the university, as I understand it, did approach him and say, would he stay on, and offered him a permanent job, but because he was such a brilliant teacher, but he decided no, he wanted to go back to England, so he left. And when he left, after he left, the history workshop sort of at UCT tended to sort of fall away, or to some mostly, and then Belinda Bazzoli picked it up and did a very good job at Wits with the history workshop there. But by the late 70s, I had moved on to other things, although one of the things that I maybe should just mention is that related to my thesis and my work on the Eastern Cape, I did attend a conference at Mount Kisco outside New York that Leonard Thompson organized, which led to the book On the Frontier in History, which was, collection of essays. Herman Gillemy was there, and George Frederickson, the famous comparative historian, and others. And it was a set of papers about South African history, and then the idea was to compare the frontier in South Africa with the frontier in America. So that was one of the last things I did on the frontiers, I recall, before. But already by then I was moving on to other things, and I was asked to do this historical dictionary, which involved more work than I'd expected, among other things.
Sorry, Lindie, I cut in, but I felt I had to.
No. I think we were going in the same direction, because I will say, Chris, you will say waste of time. I don't agree with you at all, because I listened to this and I think, well, this is so much grounding. And I think it's also fantastic that a historian who later writes historiography also had his hands dirty in the archives with the primary materials to such an extent. I do want to just also again come back to the frontier and the Eastern Cape, because this is extremely important work. I think it's been a bit neglected in recent years, but it's also an important historiographical shift. And then I wonder the link to the Kiewiet as well, in terms of looking at contact, cooperation, those concepts that were really crucial in these years. What was your take or your experience of that?
Yes, of course, Monica Wilson always talked about cooperation and so forth.
Yes.
On the Eastern Cape frontier, conflict and cooperation. But yes, I began to be interested in historiography at around this time, but to jump ahead, it was only when Leonard Thompson arranged for me to go to the Southern African Research Project at Yale, which was only in 1987, that I had the opportunity to actually meet de Kiewiet. I went to Washington to interview him, and then I also looked at his papers, which were at Cornell University. But already, and there are many sort of strands to this that I could mention that when I was at Oxford, going back to Oxford, one of the students that I met there, not in my college, in another college, was Hugh Macmillan, and he took me to meet his father. And so I met W.M. Macmillan outside Oxford, in about 1967 or something like that. And I sort of vaguely knew him on and off. He came to Cape Town to give a lecture sometime in the 70s, and I remember that quite vividly. So I was aware of some of these people, but it took a while to begin to think of writing a sort of survey. And when I did, to jump ahead again, I didn't know that Ken Smith was writing his also survey of historiography. So when I did start, I was aware that there wasn't anything really on South African historiography at that stage, and it took me some time to get going with it. And it was really only when I had the opportunity to go to SOP for 6 months with at Yale that I began to pull it together. But one other thing that I need to mention perhaps about the early 80s was that out of my work on Cape Town, I had become interested in the liberated Africans, the people who came off the slave ships and were so-called liberated in Cape Town. And then I wrote, some articles on that, which, again, to my surprise, have had a sort of long life, because people have remained interested in liberated Africans right up until almost to the present. But that's another strand in my historical work.
Why the shift to South African historiography, to writing about historians rather than about a historical topic? Obviously, it's a major watershed in your career, and it's been a hugely influential book, The Making of the South African Past. What was the conceptualization of that?
Well, I was interested in them as people. I had, as I mentioned, had the opportunity to meet a few of them. And I was aware that, to some extent, not sufficiently, of historiographical surveys elsewhere. Another thing that, if you're interested in my intellectual biography, I need to mention possibly, and this arises actually also out of the Eastern Cape as it happens, is that I became friendly with Donovan Williams, who was a historian who wrote some now neglected works on Tiasoga, and had been at Fort Hare, and he got a job at the University of Calgary. And when, after the sort of Soweto uprising, I was looking possibly to move elsewhere, and he had the opportunity to invite me to Calgary because he was going into administration, someone like Axelson. And so I went to Calgary quite a few times in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. And there I did become aware of interesting historiography of Canada, and especially relations with the indigenous people. I became friendly with Don Smith, who was a historian of that at the University of Calgary History Department, and that may have encouraged me to think about the historiography of South Africa, and I gradually decided that that's what I would do. That's
So if we can go to that, if you could describe what was your take on historiography when you finally tackled it?
Well, I just wanted to show the evolution of ideas about race and to some extent class over time, and so one had to start, with at the beginning, as I saw at the beginning with Thiel as the sort of most important historian of the 19th century. I know subsequently, Andrew Bank has said you've got to go back to John Phillip and so forth. Before that, although he wasn't really writing what he saw to be a history, whereas Thiel was. So, I did a lot of work on Thiel. I wrote a few articles published in History in Africa, for example, about Thiel's career. And then, moving on to Corey and then Macmillan's response to Thiel, basically, and then moving on to the Kiewiet and others, so it was really to show how one historian had built on the work of others before him and had wanted to overturn what has been done previously, and gradually how new sources were exploited. I mean, obviously, Macmillan with the Phillip papers, which were then burnt in the fire at the Blitz, and de Kiewiet's career, which interested me because he left South Africa at the early stage, and there was a possibility of his getting a job at UCT, and he didn't get it and stayed in the United States, and yet wrote this very brilliant History of South Africa, Social and Economic, which I still think is worth reading, because unlike Macmillan, whose work is often very turgid and difficult to read, I found, de Kiewiet just wrote in a brilliant style. So I appreciated his style. And unfortunately, I only met him right at the end of his life, and as also I met about the same time at the end of his life, Keith Hancock. When I went to Australia, I had the opportunity I went to Canberra to meet him, but unfortunately he was really beyond any proper interview at that stage. But anyway, I was interested in meeting these people, and then de Kiewiet happened to leave a remarkable collection of letters at Cornell University, as I've mentioned. So I went there to look at those, and so I was interested in but what was very problematic, of course, about that book, which is obviously flawed in many ways, and there's often been the thought of doing an update, but it's been too difficult to do. But is that I didn't really deal properly with brilliant historians. Well, Leonard Thompson, who was in a way a kind of mentor, although I had some difficulties in my relationship with him, but and then Schuyler Marx, who his work I really appreciate tremendously, and then leading on to people like Rodney Davenport and others. I would need to take all that into account if I were to do an update. But I don't think that's likely.
So I would like to jump to Rodney Davenport,
yes.
And I will,
Yes.
just a declaration of interest. He is basically one of my top favorite historians, and his book on the Afrikaner Bond I consider one of my top 3 works on South African history. So I have incredible admiration for his work, of course, but I would like to know how you became involved with revising his South Africa modern history, and your work in collaboration with him.
Well, of course, I had a long history in that I had him as a lecturer at UCT in constitutional history and law. There was a subject that I took, which was also partly in the law faculty at the time, which he taught. And then he didn't get the chair at UCT, of course, and went to Rhodes, and I saw him a few times briefly at Rhodes, but I didn't, not very much. But as you say, I've always had a deep respect for him, but I did tend to, in reviewing books, tended to be quite critical. I've always thought that if you're reviewing a book, you should be critical and not just full of praise for it. So I actually reviewed the 3rd edition of his History of South Africa, modern history, quite critically. And I never actually asked him subsequently. I didn't really like to, whether he was influenced by that, to decide eventually to ask me to help him with the 5th edition, which I did. But of course, I was greatly honored to do that because I was full of admiration for him as a historian. And I'd also appreciated, he had this political history that he was active in the Liberal Party, and, he went to the Rivonia trial to give evidence for the defendants, although he wasn't actually called because Alan Payton gave evidence and Rodney wasn't. But unfortunately, he did write a memoir before he died, but it's rather thin and not published. And I still need to find out. He gave some papers to the UCT library, and I still haven't found out whether they survived the fire or not in the African Studies Library. But anyway, the upshot is that he of course retired from Rhodes. He came to live in Cape Town, and he wanted to work on another edition of the modern history of South Africa, and he asked me to help, and I was very happy to do so. And then, if I can just carry the story on while we're talking about him, after that came out, he wanted to do another work, and unfortunately, I think he had the idea of changing to something rather different, and that was a book on strands in South African history, which was going to look at themes that ran through South African history from the earliest days to the present. And he was commissioned by the same people, Macmillan, to do that, and I was going to do that with him, and we actually wrote a few draft chapters even for that book. But I always thought that was rather too ambitious, certainly for me, to be involved in, and in the end it never got anywhere towards publication. And I think that the wiser move would have been to have updated the modern history, and then I did look around for somebody to help me do that as he was passing away, but I haven't done that yet.
You were for a long time an editor of the South African Historical Journal. What was your appraisal of its role within the discipline and your role in its fulfillment of that role? Okay,
that's I have recently written something about the SAHJ at 75, and I'm glad that it's reached 75 issues. I think I do say in that to start off with, it was had a rather shaky history. It started off as a vehicle to sort of bring together English and Afrikaans speaking historians at the time, and there were people who were rather critical of it because those tended to be, although Rodney Davenport was one of the people very much involved, but on the whole they tended to be rather more conservative historians, and certainly the Afrikaans ones were. And so for a long time, it took a long time to sort of get off the ground, I think. And then, of course, in the 70s, it had to compete with the Journal of Southern African Studies, which from the word go, had a lot of very important articles in it. And it was difficult to compete with that. But gradually over time, I think it's done well. And, of course, it's had this interesting sort of complementary relationship with Historia, but it's the best journal we've got. I hope it continues.
What was the period of your editorship?
Oh, don't ask me those kind of questions about dates, because I have difficulty remembering. But I was involved as the book editor, and I was involved with Basil Recorder was the main editor for some time in the mid-80s. I don't exactly remember the years, but I helped him then with that. Yeah.
So I'm also interested. We've been taking this discussion from the 60s into the 70s, into the 80s, and now we're getting to the early 90s. To put it mildly, you have lived through interesting times. And I would actually love to know how your experience of these decades, what was your experience being a historian during these times?
Yes.
And then also experiencing the transition, and how did that affect your views of South African history and historiography?
Yes, of course, very much so. One was caught up in all the politics of the 80s, which, especially in the late 80s, were very difficult to deal with. A lot of activity on the campus and so forth. I tended to be if I could say it with hope it's not immodest to say that I hope that my historical work would have some political role. I was always a nervous or shy person who didn't want to become actively involved in politics. Partly because the people who did were very courageous and I admired them. But that really wasn't for me. I rather did my historical work, and I hoped that it would have some sort of political spin-off as well. So anyway, that was and then in the 80s, because we were cut off here, whenever I could, I tried to go overseas and interact with people overseas. Whenever I could get a sabbatical, I was away somewhere, and so I went to Canada, as I mentioned, and then I spent some more time in England in the 1980s and so forth. But as the transition began, and of course it's a question as to where and when it began, but one began, I think, from about 1986, to sort of think that things were transitioning towards a new order, and although one didn't know what that would be. And so I began to shift my historical work towards that, and I became particularly interested in the transition in Namibia because I, along with others, thought that could pave the way, in a sense, for a transition in South Africa. And so I began looking in detail, and I spent a lot of time on what was going on in Angola, and the role of the Cubans, and the winding down of the Cold War, of course, is part of that. And so I became interested in writing about the end of the Cold War in relation to Southern Africa, and so in the 1990s, increasingly, I kept tabs on that, and then as the transition occurred in South Africa, I tried to look at that as well. But all of those subjects are so large and difficult to get to grips with that I feel as though I haven't done justice to the kind of research that I put into it, really. And so I've still, in the office in which I'm sitting at the moment at UCT, I have piles of paper which I still have the ambition maybe to pull together in some way, but whether I will or not remains to be seen.
No, we want to come to that, but also
Okay.
just before we just to set that up, you've been involved in the sort of post 1990-94 period in the DISA and Aluka digital
Yes.
project. Can you tell us
Yes.
about your work in digital history?
Yes. Well, I was never a technical person in that area, but of course I was interested in what they were doing, and in making sources available to historians. And so I was asked, it was a Mellon funded project initially, the Digital Imaging South Africa project, and I was brought in really, I think, as a historian who would give some advice about what should be digitized. And I think it was my idea to digitize the anti-apartheid journals, which were digitized, and usefully so. But then, cut a long story short, because there were endless meetings about this, there was the question of what to go on to digitized, and some of the archives. We went through lots of exercises about what archives to choose, and then we ran into the problem, of course, of the fact that if you digitized archives, then people think you're taking them offshore, and you're, copyright issues and all sorts of other problems, which I'm afraid to say in the end bored me. And so I just wanted this work to be done, and I didn't want to be bothered with all the technical issues and how you do it and so forth. So I withdrew from the project. But already by then, the Aluka project was the further project that looked at the whole region, and that was very interesting for me because it gave one access. We had some meetings Alan Isaacman organized, where historians from across the region would come together to talk about the sources. And so I'd meet people from Mozambique and Namibia and so forth, and learn about the archives there, which was very useful for me. So I was very keen to be involved with that project, but again, it didn't end up with as much success as I'd hoped. Yeah.
You just referred to all those boxes of papers behind you. And you have said that you actually have built up quite a large personal archive, and then you are affected with downscaling. So what is lost in such a process? And what are the most cherished parts of your archive?
Okay. Difficult to say because it's not in as good a state as I would like it to be. But I'm hoping that I can keep this office for another year or two. Fortunately for me, I mean, the material of some of the people that I know who've just fairly recently passed away, who include most recently David Welsh, for example, who'd been working, I don't know if you know, on the history of Afrikaner nationalism. And yes, really important work that he'd done. And he gave his papers to UCT, but as I understand, they were destroyed in the fire because they were in the library, in the reading room, because the papers that had recently been given hadn't been yet catalogued and so forth. So they were sitting in the reading room and they were destroyed, along with papers of people like Martin West and others who I used to know here. So anyway, my papers are here in this office mostly, and some of them at home. And the first job is really to sort them out and then to decide. But unfortunately, the situation here at UCT at the moment, as I understand it, I know people, of course, in the library, is that they're still totally overwhelmed with what they have to do, because they have to go through all these surviving archives and find out if they're okay. And some of them were put into cold storage for a while and so forth after the fire. And they're very short of staff and so forth. So at the moment, they can't take any new archives, basically. But I'm hopeful maybe in, say, 2 years' time, they can take some of my papers. But to say what is the most cherished part is very difficult, because in my archives, I do have some correspondence with other historians, for example. I happened to be just reading a couple of letters the other day. I had exchange with a historian who didn't become a professional historian, and now his name is not remembered, but Tony Kirk, who wrote a thesis about the Catrival settlement on the Eastern Cape frontier and so forth. I had some interesting exchanges with him and with people like Bill Freund and others, over the years. It would be a pity to just throw them out. So I'm hoping that, of course, maybe people have always said, you should scan them and so forth. So if I can get them sorted out, maybe I can scan a lot of the stuff. But we'll have to wait and see.
It's extremely valuable. I always have this saying of, I think it was in Peter Pan, that Tinkerbell said, every time someone says, I don't believe in fairies, a fairy drops down dead. And my saying is, every time someone destroys an archive or throws something away, a historian somewhere drops down dead. So this has to be preserved.
They should be. Yeah, they should be. But
It's the end straight now. What are you working on now?
That's a difficult question, because actually Lindie asked me before we came on air here. Odds and ends is the sort of answer. Although the sort of major thing that I suppose I should mention, that I've just been involved in putting together the third volume in a series that has come out from a German publisher, De Gruyter, and that arose out of my interest in the Cold War, and that led me to Eastern Europe, and I had the opportunity to go to Leipzig a couple of times. And so but the first volume was on the Southern African liberation movements in the Cold War period. The second volume was on Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and Africa in the era of decolonization. These are edited volumes, so they're collections of essays. And this third volume, which should come out in 6 months at the most, is on the role of communists in Africa in, again, the period of decolonization. So it ranges from looking at some of the European communist parties, particularly the French and Italian ones, to looking, in my case, at, of course, the role of the South African Communist Party, and also the role of communists in the region. So that would include the Cubans. And we've got a very interesting chapter on the North Koreans by Tiku van der Hoort, from, well, he's now in the Netherlands. So anyway, so that's an editing job, really, putting those together, although I've got a contribution in all of them. So there are those volumes, and then, I keep doing reviews. I've most recently reviewed Roger Southall's book on Smuts and Mandela for the Historical Journal, which should come out soon. I was for a time involved with the Bulletin of the National Library. I don't know if you're aware of that. I handed that over to Sandy Shell, but I've written quite a lot in that bulletin. So odds and ends. And then I do surveys of countries in the region for Africa south of the Sahara, which is a large survey book, which there's, and also for something called the Annual Register, which again comes out every year, and you do an update on countries in the region over the last year. And I now do Zimbabwe and South Africa for that. So it's odds and ends.
Well, what you call odds and ends, I call three people's jobs. So, this is impressive. So, Chris, to finish off, I would like to know if you could recommend three South African books or history books that you think all young South African historians absolutely have to read. What would those be?
Well, the first one to start with, of course, is Thula's book, his History of South Africa, which
Agreed.
Yes, which I did
Three-
review
three
somewhere.
others perhaps. I think
I reviewed that for the Bulletin of the National Library, if I remember. Anyway, of course, no, it's really a splendid work, and I admire greatly. So I think that's. And then secondly, I think maybe Kiewiet's history, which I mean, it came out in 1941. Can you believe it? But it's just from a matter of style. I think it deserves to be reread. And then a third one is very difficult to say, but again, as a brilliant work of social history, I still recommend Charles van Onsselen's New Nineveh, New Babylon, the studies in the social and economic history of the Witwatersrand. I think it's a brilliant piece of social history. So those are just three, but of course I could mention others.
one worldie, one from Global History Beyond.
Sorry.
One from taking the South African limitation out of it, a world historical book.
A world historical one. But can I mean, it's not taking South Africa out, but of course the work of George Frederickson, the comparative work, comparing the United States and South Africa. I mean, his two books, White Supremacy and Black Liberation. I think those are, but it's sort of world history books, I mean, I still think of E.P. Thompson's, Making of the English Working Class, or books like that, or E.P. Thompson's, books. I mean, they're all brilliant works of history. Christopher Hill, to some extent, but rather narrow, on the English Revolution. Endless books to read. Not time enough to read.
Awesome.
Well, actually, right now, I just feel like digging back into all those books again, because those are our happy places. Chris, I want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us. It's quite a privilege when you learn about someone. Again, I mean, all the names you mention, it's like a hall of fame. It's all the who's that I learned about as a student, and yours included. And then finally getting to speak to you and hearing this as a very real human story. I say thank you to you very much.
Thank you. And of course, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to meet some of these people and to have the opportunity to now talk about them. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks again.